Um,
Okay.
so, what year did you start working in Barrow, which is now known as Utkerbik, and what brought you there?
Well, my first time in Barrow was in 1950 with the U.S. Geologic Survey, and I was part of the Naval Oil Unit that where the Navy wanted to investigate what oil, if any, is in Petroleum Reserve Number 4. So they contracted with the Geologic Survey to, or requested them just to form a group to study this. And that was in the USGS. It was referred to as the Navy Oil Unit. And the chief of it was George Gritch. I'm sure you've heard of that name. Um, George was a graduate at the University of Minnesota, where I was at the time. And he inspired the young people, and I was very young then, much younger than I am now. But we saw the building of geologic maps, which was just done only on the streams, because that's what they did, is to go down the streams in fold boats from up in the where they had been landed up into the Brooks Range or just below it. And they mapped in those paths. And then when I was joined them, I was keen to get up there. That was in 49, 48, 49, 50. And we mapped, had air photos made in 1949 that we mapped directly on in 1950. So the survey then had what they called the line haul. It went from Fairbanks to Barrow to Umiat and Barter Island and then back to Fairbanks. Some days it would not go to Barter Island, but it almost went from Fairbanks, Barrow, and then to Umiat. So that's my first time in Barrow was there, and I had a meal at the lab and got a chance to look around a little bit, but not much because we went right on into Umiat. I came back to Barrow after I finished with that, and I finished my graduate work at Caltech and came back to Alaska in 1960 and started working on the seasonal snow cover. And that was all done out of the lab at Barrow. But I wanted to find places where I could measure the drifted snow. The goal here was to find out how much snow came down and how much was moved by the winds in each direction. And in 1980, published a paper on that called a reassessment of the winter precipitation on the Arctic slope. And it was based on earlier work done by Bob Black of the USGS, where he identified that the weather records were always less than reality. And so there was much more precip there than showed in the records. And I measured the snow on the tundra directly in places where there were no drifts. And then the drift to get at the amount of blowing snow in each direction, two primary directions. I worked with people from the weather or the Forest Service. They'd been building snow fences to keep the snow off certain roads, especially in Wyoming. And they came up with a system of putting a snow gauge with fences around it to stir the wind and help the snow deposit. And that gave a much higher record of what actually comes down. And so we built the first of those on the Arctic slope, and then came up with the idea of building fences. And at first people said, no, we don't have any fences here. They didn't understand, I think, what we were talking about, because what we were trying to do is build a fence just to make a drift form behind it, and that would keep the snow from forming further down. The first one was at Wainwright, where houses were being totally buried by drifts. And we managed to get all the drifted snow behind this one big snow fence, and the houses were pretty well clear of snow at the time. It also built a big reservoir of water that could be uh, used for drinking water if people kept the place clean. But with dogs running all over the place, it was hard to do.
What highlights, if any, stand out from your experience doing research in the Arctic?
Well, the highlight is understanding how the snow cover looks. The snow across the whole Arctic slope is very much like the snow in the Greenland ice sheet for the first year. And in Greenland, you just add another year on top and another year and another year. The ice sheet keeps growing. And the reason it doesn't increase in altitude is because of the flow. On the Arctic slope, you get that same structure for the first year where there's this very low depth north. I think the um, Inuit name for that is pukak at the base of the snow cover, a very coarse crystalline material. That forms because of the steep temperature gradient in the snow, and it changes the structure. The top part is usually hard and wind packed. That's exactly the sort of thing that you get in the first year on the ice sheet. But it impressed me that the whole Arctic slope and the northern part of Siberia and Canada all has that same structure to the first year of snowpack. The other thing was the just being in the Arctic. I've always enjoyed that from my first year in 1950. That convinced me of my earlier interest that this is just a great place to work. I enjoyed working at the lab. I remember the Quonset huts that we stayed in. There was that one big two uh, double deck Quonset hut that we had. I know I had a place to stay there a couple times, and it was especially interesting in the winter when there was a snow blowing hard outside, and you were snuggled into your sleeping bag inside the hut. And the mess hall was always good. We had wonderful food. So I thought of the barrel as a base for a laboratory was just perfect. And I think if you can keep this going, I hope it is going just like it was when it was, we called it ARL at the time. And then the Navy worried that people were forgetting that they funded it. So they wanted an N put on the front for Naval Arctic Research Lab.
So, are there things that you learned from Arctic residents or indigenous knowledge holders that helped you as a scientist understand what you were seeing, and what were they?
I learned from several people. I think Pete Savalik, I think you remember him, and Kenny Tuvek. They both knew a lot about the Arctic and the winds and problems of dressing and keeping yourself from freezing to death. Kenny Tuvek was very especially valuable out on the ice with people. And I learned from, it was Harry Brower and one of his friends, and the two of them went out with us to Lake Nolek to build a little cabin one time for to be used as a research base. And I just learned things in general, not necessarily toward the research, but they understood the way the snowpack looked and how it formed. And I was impressed, though, that they had a lot of knowledge that people like the birds, even birds that weren't useful for uh, game birds for eating or anything like that, they seemed to know a lot about just the natural cycle. And it always appealed to me that this would be a great place, especially for the biologists and bird people, to be getting to know the people. But I learned a little bit about that, but that's because that wasn't my field. I was just impressed how much knowledge there was.
Do you have any closing thoughts? Do you have anything else you want to add or mention?
One closing thought I would have is I think the lab did a lot for science. I think it also did a lot for the people of Barrow because rather than hiring all people from outside, and I think Max Brewer deserves a lot of credit there, they made sure they had a lot of people from the village working at the lab. And this then, first of all, economically, it put money into the village in the hands of people that weren't, there were several wealthy families in Barrow early on, mainly from running the store Browers had. And now you had people in the village that had money separate from the old style. So it changed the economy to some extent. But I think the lab has proven to be valuable for research, but I think it was valuable also for the community at Barrow to, first from the point of view of income, but also from the point of view of education. They learned a lot about what was being done in the world outside of Barrow and what research was important. And then they fit into many of these um, projects. I was impressed with how ingenious some of the people were there at maintaining equipment and doing things. Even out in the field, they would take apart a snow machine. And one time I was working at Atkusuk and we were studying that big set of drifts there. And all of a sudden, some people just showed up. Two young men showed up and they said, if you have radio contact with Barrow, we need some parts. I thought, well, they might need spark plugs or something. No, I said, we need a piston rod and engine. Oh my God, they were taking the whole thing apart and rebuilding it out there. And so we put in their order, things came. And that impressed me because a lot of people that came, let's say, came out of different parts of the states or any part of the lower latitude having trouble, they just say it's broken and leave it and go away. These guys found out what was wrong. They're going to fix it right there. And they did. And that impressed me a lot. Harry Brower, when we were there, he carved, there was a piece of walrus, I mean, not walrus, sorry, but a mammoth tusk. Found it and it was coming apart in little flakes. It had the curve of the tusk. But he carved a neat little knife-looking letter opener. It looked like a little knife, had a hilt on it, a little handle, and then the blade for letter opener. And as we were leaving, I saw him carving on this thing, and when we were leaving, he said, "Here, I want to give this to you as a memento of our time here." And that means a lot to me. I still have it, a little case with some ivory carvings, but that I just really got to love the people.